please. My first job after college, I was a youth director at a church in Fridley. I had the privilege to work with Ben Johnson, who is a lifelong friend of mine. And when I say lifelong, like Ben literally lived next door when I was born. So I've known him, I don't know when I met him formally, but so when I say lifelong, I mean lifelong. And we convinced this church, and I still don't know what they were thinking, but we convinced the church to hire the two of us to work together. He was the director of high school ministries. I had a chance to work with the middle schoolers. But because we were such good friends, there was just a ton of collaboration that happened on a pretty regular basis with the work that we were doing. And so we collectively would lead a Bible study Sunday evening with the high school students. And this particular Sunday, we were going to do some reflecting on this text. Now, the interesting thing about this text, this is one of the few stories that's in all four of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all give an account of this event. Now, as you can imagine, from a little different perspective, but this event where Jesus enters into the temple and out of anger, disgust, need for change, is flipping tables. And we thought, well, let's let the kids really know what this might have been about. So what we did is we said, all right, when everybody came, we're going to have them play games. And we set out games, and one of the games we set up particularly was Monopoly. You know, you've got the dice, you've got the boat, the shoe, the dog, the cat, the ship, all those little pieces, and then money. I mean, everybody needs money to play the game. So we had Monopoly set up and a couple other pieces, or a couple other games around the room. And the plan was for the games to get set up, give the kids about 10-15 minutes to play. And so that's what we did. I had snuck out of the room and gave them that 10 to 15 minutes. And the plan was for me to come in and disrupt this game. And so I came bursting through the door, raising my voice, saying, "What is going on? Why are you playing this in the church?" And I took the Monopoly game and I threw it in the air. I walked over to the other table and threw all the game pieces off of there. And I said, "This is not what we do in God's house." And they're like, "You told us to." Yeah, maybe we did. But it doesn't take much of our imagination to recreate what that day might have been like in the temple when Jesus walked in. This is what Jesus walked into had been going on for many, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It was the Passover. And so the Jewish people were traveling from wherever they were to the temple to worship at Passover. And one of the things that took place during Passover was the sacrifice of an animal for the atonement of their sin. And atonement means for God to forgive them of the things they had done wrong. They sacrificed animals to get God to find favor in them. This happened throughout Scripture. And so, as you can imagine, I think about my family, Jen and I and our three kids, and we're going to walk a long distance to get to the temple. The last thing I'm going to bring with me is a goat or a donkey or a cow, right? It's going to be enough to get my three rugrats from where I am to the temple. I'm not going to try to convince a stubborn donkey to come with me. And so when you would arrive at the temple, there would be people selling these animals so that you could purchase that animal and then ultimately, in the midst of worship, offer it up as a sacrifice so that for this idea of atonement, so that our sins could be forgiven. This was a practice that was going on and on and on. But that day, Jesus walks in and has something different to say. Now we think about that moment when Jesus walked in and that he was angered. And I think let's talk a little bit about anger for a minute. Anger is emotion all of us experience from time to time. Maybe you've even experienced it in the last 45 minutes. And anger isn't a bad thing at all. It's just how it comes out. I think one of the things we get trapped with when we read that Jesus was angry and he walked in and he flipped the tables and he whipped the cows and donkeys and goats and doves to clear out of there, we think, well, at least in my mind, maybe I'm different than you, but I kind of like steam coming out of his ears. But anger also can induce a desire for change. It can, when we name, sometimes we get angry when we identify places of injustice or practices that are not okay, and we get angry and we respond to those things. And if we respond to those things with steam coming out of our ears, it's usually not that productive. But when anger motivates us to speak of injustice, to rise, to bring attention to those places where things aren't right, that change is a good thing, right? And so I think it's helpful for us to think that Jesus enters in not steam coming out of his ears, but a desire for things to be different. These last few weeks and these next few weeks coming, we were reflecting on this invitation of come and see. So there we are, bystanders at the temple that day, watching this happen. Watching Jesus walk in and tables being turned, we are invited to receive or be exposed to yet another aspect of Jesus. And we often think the point of this text is the tables that got flipped and the coins that went scattering and the animals that were pushed out. But I would argue that's not the point of this text at all, particularly from John's perspective. I think we ought to pay attention to what happens after that. I think we get so caught up in like, whoa, this calm, compassionate, loving Jesus has a different set of emotions that are coming out, and we aren't quite sure what to do with that, and we miss this next section. At verse 18, after Jesus has done all of this and ran everything out and said, stop making my Father's house a marketplace, the Jews then said to him, what sign can you show us for doing this? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days. And the Jews said to him, this temple's been under construction for 46 years and you will raise it up in 3 days? Here's the point. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Jesus desired a change. And Jesus, as he entered the temple that day, part of that change was this transformation of our minds of understanding who Jesus was and what the temple was. I mean, it's almost a little bit of a slap in the face that Jesus said the temple will be rebuilt in 3 days, because these folks, 46 years is a long time for a construction project to take place. And he's going to rebuild it in 3 years, or 3 days. We know that he is speaking of his death on the cross and then the resurrection from the grave that will follow 3 days later. We know that Jesus is inviting us to come and see a different understanding of the temple. And in the temple, as the Jews understand it, is the place where God dwells. It's where God's name is declared and made holy. And the fascinating thing that Jesus does is, after the coins have stopped rolling and makes this declaration, ultimately what Jesus is inviting us to understand is Jesus or God and the dwelling of God and God, the declaration of God's name is going to happen everywhere. We don't have to come to the place that has a steeple and a cross, because Jesus doesn't stay in the temple. What does he do? He goes back to the streets, and he and his disciples and this crowd of folks continue to declare to the world what God's love looks like. And so, by transforming this understanding of what the temple is, we can transform our understanding of where God dwells and where God's name is declared. It's not just here. Does it happen here? Well, I sure hope so. But it'll happen this afternoon, and tomorrow when you go to work, and tomorrow evening when you get the shovel out, just Well, yeah, God's in the midst of that too. Jesus has invited us to come and see. To come and see that He desires for things to be different. He desires for both physical things and spiritual things to be different. For us to understand that He is the one where God dwells, and it doesn't just sit and stay there. It goes out into the streets as He sits with those who are sick and heals the blind, where He converses with those who have lost loved ones, and He transforms the world by declaring to the world, this is what God's love looks like. But it doesn't end there. By Jesus making this declaration that He is the temple and that the temple will be raised in 3 days, He also has made this declaration to us that He will be forever the sacrifice for the atonement of our sin. Before that, we had to show up and we had to bring something to offer God to make us right in this relationship that you and I, that you have with God and I have with God. We know because of the death, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ that has been taken care of now. So instead of having to show up to bring a gift, we show up to receive the gift. To receive this gift of forgiveness and love and compassion that God has set forth to bring to God's people. This is a gift for you and for me to receive. We, on an ongoing, every moment basis, are made right because of what Christ has done for us. Now, that doesn't mean we don't stop showing up. That doesn't mean we don't stop giving of ourselves, but it has a different perspective now. It has a different purpose. It's not to get God to pay attention to us or for God to find favor in us. It's in response to what God has done. Excuse me. What God has... I'm not going to cry. I'm sure it probably felt like, oh, John's really choked up. No, I don't know what happened there. So we continue to show up, we continue to give of ourselves, not for God to find favor, but so that we can then, in return, we have the opportunity to give. Because we are here to receive. We are here to come and see all that Christ is, and then we are reminded to go forth as we are sent out to all the places where God dwells, to make declaration of the love that God has for the world, to allow that anger that is in us where there are places of injustice, to speak truth and to demand change so that all might live in abundance. We have been invited to come and see, and I'll invite you again next week and every week after. But we come and see to be filled up to receive. And we don't just sit here. We are then sent out to declare, to give witness, and to change the world with this transformative love. We give thanks for that kind of God. Amen.
Amen.